them. Someone killed my parents. Were they shot? Yes.
It sent shockwaves around the world, and the repercussions are certain to be felt for years to come.
When the children started talking about robes and candles, you could see that it had to be satanic.
We are continuing to examine evidence, following up on a substantial...
Wanted by the FBI as a criminal instead of a victim. The shocker, it was stunning. I have seen ambulances. I cannot tell you if there have been any injuries.
It's an evil act of terror.
On August 20th, 1989, Kitty and Jose Menendez were gunned down in their Beverly Hills home. When I heard about the double murder, the thing that stuck out to me at the time was the fact that it happened in Beverly Hills. Murders don't happen in Beverly Hills, not where they live. So that's what made the murder shocking. The descriptions that came out about the crime scene was the blood. It was everywhere. It was the brutality of the murders.
Autopsy reports and crime scene photographs showed Jose Menendez had been shot 5 times, once point blank with the barrel of the shotgun to the back of his head. And Kitty Menendez was shot 9 times, once point blank in the face.
When the police first arrived, the victim's sons, Erik and Lyle Menendez, were incredibly hysterical, screaming. Police automatically assumed that they were victims themselves. They were treating them as the sons who had walked in on this blood-filled house with their parents lying dead.
I've not been told any statements that said that it was or was not a hit, or it was a robbery, or it was something else. We're not sure, and we're not speculating at this time what it may have been.
Because this was such a brutal hit, it was almost like an execution. In the initial stages of the investigation, police were looking into possible mob ties. The other part of the shock factor about this murder was the fact that Jose Menendez was this big-time executive. I mean, he was one of the movers and shakers in Hollywood and had it all.
One of the top Hollywood companies at the Cannes Film Festival was Carrico. It had its 2 biggest stars at the festival: Sylvester Stallone, who stars in the Rambo movies for Carrico, and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Among the Carrico executives, Jose Menendez was a tough, uncompromising contender.
The story of Los Angeles is often the story of Hollywood, and people are fascinated by Hollywood executives. Jose Menendez was like the great American dream story. He came as an immigrant from Cuba, incredibly hardworking. He had a very quick rise up into the Hollywood business. Before he came to Hollywood, though, he met his sweetheart, Kitty Menendez, a hometown girl, and they fell in love immediately. And they had 2 beautiful sons. If Facebook had been around back in the day, their Facebook feed would have been filled with wonderful photographs of them looking like the great American family. So already you have the makings of an American story.
When 7 months later, they arrest Erik and Lyle Menendez, it was stunning. That's when everything turned and it became a national sensation.
People had felt really sorry for them when their parents were brutally murdered, and now you see them turning themselves into police, They're shown on television and in all of the entertainment magazines and newspapers as these very handsome, very wealthy, incredibly privileged Hollywood young men. So now this great American crime just got much more interesting.
When you look at the lives of Erik and Lyle Menendez, it seems like they lived a charmed life. They were golden boys. Lyle was at Princeton, Erik was accepted at UCLA, and it just seemed like they didn't want for anything. They came from a good home. They were two young, white, privileged males who were rich. I guess I thought to myself, boy, why would you do that? I couldn't understand it. None of it made sense to me.
Unbeknownst to us and everybody else, the police had been investigating Erik and Lyle Menendez almost from the start.
The police did suspect the brothers, but were not able to make an arrest until they finally got a confession by Erik to his psychiatrist.
Authorities did not arrest the sons till after obtaining tape recordings from Dr. Jerome Oziel, the Menendez family psychologist, who conversed with the sons after the killings.
Authorities say Erik Menendez confessed to the therapist, and Lyle Menendez is said to have threatened the therapist if he ever turned them in to police.
In other news this morning, the Menendez brothers have pleaded not guilty to charges of killing their parents last August.
At the arraignment, when the brothers walked in, I remember thinking, that's not a good look, because they were in these really expensive suits. And they walked in and they had a swagger about them. They looked spoiled, they looked arrogant, and they looked entitled. And looking at them in the courtroom, you thought, they did it, you know, they did it.
This is the case of the people of the state of California versus Erik, Galen Menendez, and Joseph Lyle Menendez. You understand the charges against you?
I understand both of them, Your Honor.
For those two charges, you could be sentenced to death.
When they pled not guilty, I didn't believe them. I don't think anybody did.
I've been in this business for over 33 years, and I've heard of very few murders that were more savage than this one was.
What about a motive?
It's no big secret that the Menendezes had an estate that was worth millions of dollars. One more question.
The first thing that people thought about was, how could they have committed such a brutal crime? And it led people to immediately believe it had to just be about bad seeds and money and greed.
$14 million provides ample motive to some people to commit murder. And one sometimes does not need to look beyond that as a motive.
Please. Hi, just can I introduce myself, please?
The interest by us in the media and the public just kept building because it had it all. It was violent, it was brutal, it was Beverly Hills.
I had flown over from Miami to LA to cover the story for the Miami Herald. And within a couple days, I started getting calls from movie producers asking me, if I would meet with them to talk about the story. And this was something that had never happened to me in my career. I was actually being wined and dined by all kinds of people. They were interested in doing a TV movie or a feature movie. So by the time that the brothers were arraigned, there had been a full-blown Hollywood feeding frenzy.
If ever a plot was made for the movies, this is it. The Menendez murder is a gothic tale of glamour, wealth, power, and greed.
Beyond belief. It's beyond belief. It's like it can only happen in Hollywood.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Slim.
People became fascinated about it because of the characters in the story. The characters were people who we often will read about in great American crime books.
Investigators say one reason they began to zero in on the Menendez boys is that they didn't do a very good job of acting the roles of grieving sons. Police say the boys went on a wild spending spree, and unlike the relatives of most murder victims, the Menendez boys did not seem to take much interest in the police search for their parents' murderers.
Details started to come out about the behavior of Erik and Lyle Menendez right after the murder of their parents. And it just started building and building and building.
The boys began spending the family income on expensive cars and clothing.
Lyle bought a Porsche and a restaurant.
And there was the will. The entire $14 million estate would go to the boys if their parents died simultaneously.
All of the information that was being reported in media stories was very damning for the brothers.
2 days before the murders, 2 12-gauge shotguns were bought at a Big Five sporting goods store in San Diego. Prosecutors say one of the brothers bought the guns.
By the time the trial was about to get started, Lyle and Erik Menendez had been tried and convicted in the press already. It was a foregone conclusion that they were guilty, that they were going to be found guilty. And so people were thinking, okay, these 2 rich kids are going to get theirs, finally.
Because it seemed like the police and prosecutors had all the evidence they needed, people really wondered what the brothers' defense would be.
There was a lot of anticipation about this trial because it was so sensational. Everybody knew the trial was going to be big, but nobody could have predicted just how big it would be. And all of it had to do with the defense that was presented. That was the shocker. That's what made it huge.
The defense will claim the boys were abused by their parents. One defense attorney has told the judge she plans to use a self-defense strategy.
We have evidence that will prove that they were experiencing fear, that they were in imminent danger of death or great bodily injury at the hands of their parents.
The public was shocked. For the first time, the brothers admitted that they killed their parents.
No one expected that defense. No one. It caught everyone by surprise. They basically alleged that Erik and Lyle Menendez killed their parents after years of emotional and sexual abuse.
Attorneys for the Menendez boys say they will use the same defense employed for battered women. Homicide is self-defense.
It is a landmark case, the use of a battered wife defense in the killing of one's parents.
On the eve of trial, Erik and Lyle's defense attorneys sprung on prosecutors that the brothers were going to reveal the abuse, and this led them to believe that their parents were going to kill them, and so they killed their parents in self-defense. It's something that's known as the imperfect self-defense, that due to this lifetime of abuse and fear, that they unreasonably believed that their own lives were in danger. If they could pull off that defense, the jury would be able to convict them of a much lesser crime of manslaughter.
People were very skeptical because for 3 years they'd only heard one story. Greedy rich kids did it for the money. And now the defense was telling a completely different story, and people didn't believe it.
When the trial of Lyle and Erik Menendez begins later today, they will attempt to put the character and reputation of their murdered parents on trial. One prosecutor is accusing the defense team of, quote, blatant character assassination.
In the 90s, sexual abuse hadn't become front and center like it is now. You know, it was unheard of that that would be used as a motive for murder. And there were a lot of critics because the people who could refute it were dead. You know, so the accusations that their sons were throwing their way, who was there to say, hey, they're lying? Nobody.
When the full defense strategy was revealed, it was disconcerting and surprising to everyone in the DA's office. It was definitely something that gave everybody pause for concern. Everyone was thinking, my goodness, this is something that we've seen before, but in this context, there's a lot that we're going to have to find out about.
In California, a jury hears opening statements today in the trial of two Beverly Hills brothers accused of murdering their wealthy parents.
The unusual trial is being conducted with two juries, one for each brother.
Between the ages of 6 and 18, my client, Erik Menendez, was sexually molested by his father.
Opening statements were riveting. Leslie Abramson was a force of nature. The whole time I was watching her, I had to keep in mind, she's trying to convince us of something. I won't say that her opening statements were persuasive because I had agreed to wait and listen for the evidence. But I was impressed with her presentation.
Kitty Menendez was portrayed as a woman who knew and did nothing. She allegedly had other problems as well.
She was threatening to poison the family. A crazy woman got even crazier.
People were very surprised because you're talking about an incredibly wealthy family, a very public family where there are pictures upon pictures upon pictures of this loving family smiling with everything that they seemingly could want.
To say that behind those gilded walls, there was this ugly, ugly secret, it was just shocking.
Already the trial has drawn national media attention with scores of camera crews vying for interviews.
The trial was like a carnival. There were hundreds of people outside the courtroom, dozens of TV crews, reporters covering the trial.
Gentlemen, you're really obstructing us now.
And inside the courtroom, Court TV was broadcasting the trial gavel to gavel.
Lyle swung the door open and shot his father, and Erik said he shot his mom as she was standing up and yelling.
The courtroom was just sizzling with energy the whole time you were in there.
I'm going to object to that answer, Your Honor. This witness has been trying to do this.
The prosecutors and the defense attorneys were in battle, in an incredible battle that had such incredibly high stakes.
The defense is expected to begin its presentation this week.
Defense attorneys promised to take jurors behind the walls of the Menendez mansion and reveal a house of horror.
When the defense started presenting their case, they called witness after witness, friends, family members, colleagues, who painted a picture of Jose Menendez that was terrifying. And the picture that the defense painted of Kitty Menendez was a mother who was also verbally abusive, an alcoholic, a drug addict, who allowed her husband to victimize her sons.
She would just turn her fist up and then she would squint, her teeth would just come out, the veins in her neck would pop.
The data about Mr. Menendez had to do with terrorizing, exploiting, corrupting.
And would you see bruises on the
Yes.
boys after that?
Yes, and they're above their thigh area.
There was so much evidence of this oppressive childhood that they had that it was hard to ignore, especially when the family members testified. Family members were testifying against Jose and Kitty. They were not testifying against Erik and Lyle.
The cousin testified that in 1976, 8-year-old Lyle told her of molestation.
He and his dad had been touching each other, and he indicated that it was in his genital area.
A cousin, Andy Cano, said Erik confided in him details of the alleged abuse.
Well, he told me his father was massaging his.
Yes, it is very common for people that have been molested
to not come forward with that information.
Even when they're seeing a professional?
Correct.
Talk shows, people with varying opinions would get on and argue about what was more likely true. Many people still believe that the abuse defense was all a lie. And then there were others who believed that it could be true, or it must be true, or that something happened in that household.
Those of us who were there every day, we saw a lot of detail, and some people were starting to, have some doubts about the prosecution's version of events.
Both brothers are expected to give their version of why they admittedly fired 15 shotgun blasts into their parents here at the family's Beverly Hills mansion. Defense attorneys say Lyle could begin telling that much-awaited story by the end of the week.
The testimony of Erik and Lyle Menendez was going to be the key that was going to make or break the defense.
The fact that Lyle and Erik Menendez took the stand in their own defense added a huge element of drama to the story. People were anticipating it, but didn't know quite what to expect.
Everybody in the courtroom knew that the first day of Lyle Menendez's testimony was going to be a big day. It began at 2 in the afternoon after the lunch break. And the first hour, until we took a break, was the most compelling, dramatic testimony I've ever seen in a courtroom. Lyle Menendez blew that courtroom away.
Between the ages of 6 and 8, did your father have sexual contact with you?
Yes.
Did you want to do this?
When Lyle Menendez took the stand and really immediately broke down, you could hear a pin drop. And if you looked around you, you just saw people just hanging on all of his words and really in shock and disbelief.
The description of the abuse, especially the sexual abuse, was jaw-dropping. I mean, I can remember it to this day. It was beyond uncomfortable to hear the details.
Did you ask him not to?
Yes.
How did you ask him not to?
I just told him, I don't.
He was emotional, and the audience was emotional. I could feel the emotion, but I didn't cry like so many others did, because it was very, very important for me to be analyzing everything he said. Every minute I was thinking, okay, is he telling the truth? Is he not telling the truth? But he was so convincing that I figure he's either telling the truth or he's the best actor I've ever seen in my life.
And he said that he didn't mean to hurt me. And he loved me.
Was that important to you, that he loved you?
Yes, very. But I still didn't want to do it.
It was just shocking to see, a 20-something-year-old man at that time break down like that and to not know in your own mind what to believe. If you can commit that kind of murder, you can certainly lie. So I definitely never put it past these two brothers to lie to try to get away with the murder. I just don't know which parts they were lying and which parts they were telling the truth.
To discuss this case among yourselves.
After the testimony, the reaction of the jury was so profound that for the prosecution, there was a lot of concern that this case could go wrong for all the wrong reasons, not because of the facts or not because of the law, but because people would be so swayed by emotions.
We see all the time new kinds of defenses. This defense, and not to be flip about it, is the abuse made me do it. Yeah.
The defense really tried to change who the villains of this story were. But in terms of the media, it was, no matter how you slice it, this was a savage murder.
Many people in the legal world now say the abuse defense allows kids to get away with cold-blooded murder.
Abuse need not be present. Quite often, abuse comes in the door when the lawyer comes in the door.
At the end of each trial day, the judge admonished the jurors to avoid news of the trial. It was almost impossible, and one of my clues that the media was prosecution biased is that whenever I did talk to friends, even if we didn't talk specifically about the trial, they sometimes couldn't help themselves by asking me, "Did you hang him yet?"
The average person consuming a media story, they were only getting the headlines. There were people that were doing good journalism who told a neutral story, but the high-profile media continued to be really somewhat pro-prosecution. The people who were there every day saw much more information.
When I watched that testimony from both boys, it gave me pause. They looked like they were in pain as they were testifying. I'd never seen anything like it.
My dad.
In Erik's testimony, when it came time to talk about the abuse, he was so reluctant to say the words out loud.
Can you answer the question?
Yes. My dad had been molesting me.
It was a horrible moment, and in the jury box, the man I was sitting next to wrote in his notebook, "Alleges father abused him," period. And then he closed his notebook, put it down on the ground, and crossed his arms. And it was little things like that that told me we were going to have a problem in the jury room.
Here in Los Angeles, one of California's most notorious crime stories now is heading toward its final phase.
Would money have really been an adequate trade-off for you to have lived the life that Lyle Menendez lived?
The sexual abuse is here to make the parents look so bad that you don't care that they're dead.
Prosecutor Bozanich called the sexual abuse allegations complete fabrications. But for those who disagree, she made one final point.
The state doesn't execute child molesters.
If you can't abide by the rules laid down by your father, then you can just get out of the house. You can hit the road.
Which rule is it that Erik didn't want to follow? I'll tell you which one it was. Get on your knees.
Once the closing arguments were finished, the trial was over. There was nothing more that the attorneys could do. It was all in the hands of these two juries. There was great anticipation to see what they would do because we knew that members of the public, reporters, most of the country was split.
Tomorrow in this country, 2 juries resume their deliberations in the Menendez murder case.
The judge's instructions to both juries make not guilty verdicts legally impossible.
The judge will give them the option of convicting the brothers on charges ranging from voluntary manslaughter to murder in the first degree.
During deliberations, the women on Erik's jury had reason to believe that some of the men either were watching the news or had a source of information that I believe put pressure on them to convict rather than to be seen as gullible in the eyes of the public.
Still no verdict from the 2 juries in the Menendez brothers' murder trials. The jury for Lyle Menendez has completed 16 days of deliberations, and the jury for Erik Menendez has finished 14.
We spent the next month arguing. The women on Erik's jury, we were all about the evidence. And the men, they were all about justifying their opinion that this couldn't have happened in the way that the Menendez brothers said. It was all about their doubt that a man could ever abuse their sons. We had a split jury down gender lines because half the jury, which was all of the men, wanted to vote for murder, and all of the women wanted to vote for manslaughter.
Tonight, with the Erik Menendez jury deadlocked, a mistrial has been declared in his case.
In Los Angeles today, a mistrial for Lyle Menendez.
Clancy, your thoughts on a possible retrial? Do you think this is going to
You really couldn't find a group of people in a room that agreed on this case. So to expect the jurors to was a very, very high expectation, and they weren't able to do it.
Everybody's going to slow down. I'm not going to run away, so just take your time.
Don't you feel some measure of success in that you were able to convince some of the people on the jury, at least, that child abuse here was an excuse for murder?
No, we never argued that child abuse is an excuse for murder. What we argued is child abuse creates a terrible fear, and that fear in a certain set of circumstances can cause people to act because they feel they have no choice.
In the DA's office, there was a feeling that kind of demoralizing, because there was a feeling that justice had been perverted. And when you add another level of media scrutiny, the pressure becomes very, I don't want to say unbearable, but it certainly is higher than what I think the average human being can imagine.
For the DA's office, it was a devastating loss. It was one of the most high-profile cases they had ever handled. It was an embarrassment.
Any questions any of you have?
How did you lose the case?
Don't talk about losing. We did not lose the case. This is not winning or losing. It's not a game of basketball or baseball or football. This is justice. We are going to be trying the case a second time.
Are you going to pursue the death penalty, Bill?
I have every intention of going forward with the death penalty, yes.
We told the truth the first time. There's only one truth. We're going to tell the truth again to the extent that we're allowed to.
Judge Weisberg wanted the second trial to be more efficient. He decided there would not be two juries, there would be one jury. Now the prosecutors had the benefit of hindsight, and so the second time around, the prosecution had the advantage.
One thing that we have asked the judge to do is to limit the so-called abuse excuse, to limit evidence that has nothing to do with this case.
Judge Weisberg didn't allow most of the testimony about the alleged abuse into evidence. And that was very key because it narrowed the scope of the trial.
Another thing that Weisberg did was he kicked the camera out of the courtroom. And without a camera in the courtroom, he knew that it was going to cut down, way down, on the media coverage.
In the office, people would ask me about, well, aren't you worried that, if we lose again, we're just going to look like we don't know what we're doing or we're incompetent? And so it did feel like the weight of the office is on your shoulders.
Erik and Lyle Menendez are back in court today for the retrial in Los Angeles.
The prosecution seems to be taking a different tack this time. One that seems to say, even if the Menendez brothers were abused, what difference does it make?
We took the jury through a complete reconstruction of the actual crime to show how deliberate and how well planned it was. This was not something where they just went in, guns flailing, shooting crazily because they were just so terrified that their parents were going to kill them. It was a premeditated murder, which also included kneecapping of the parents so that the police, when investigating it, would think it was a mob hit.
By cutting out that family history that had been so compelling in the first trial, the second trial was much more like a traditional murder trial.
Erik and Lyle Menendez averted their eyes when prosecutors showed the jury videotape of the Beverly Hills murder scene.
For myself personally, I was frustrated because there was an overwhelming amount of mitigating evidence in the first trial.
I don't think it was fair at all. In the first trial, when I covered it, the alleged sexual abuse led to reasonable doubt. It gave you pause,
It has been hell. Our whole theory of the defense, which was a theory of self-defense, imperfect self-defense, he refused to instruct on it.
Weisberg ruled against the defense time and time again.
Another key change was that the jury was only allowed to vote on first-degree murder or second-degree murder. Manslaughter was off the table, so it was either all or nothing.
We argued successfully that, in fact, there's just no factors to support a voluntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is in the heat of the moment. You grab a gun and shoot somebody because your passions are so inflamed. It was all thought out ahead of time. They had gone and deliberately purchased guns under fake names so that they'd have the guns ready. So that's deliberation. They had a plan to create a fake alibi. It's all testified to. And all of that negates voluntary manslaughter. Leslie did a masterful job in the first trial of obfuscating what was really going on.
Good evening. Tonight, the place of murder, justice, and outrage in America. And we'll begin in California, where this time the stories of abuse, incest, and psychological terror didn't work. This time, a Los Angeles jury went beyond the tearful testimony of brothers Lyle and Erik Menendez and found them guilty of the shotgun murders of their mother and father.
Excuse us, move out of the way, please. Excuse us, make room.
I was sad about the verdicts, but I was not surprised because I had followed the second trial as best I could. And I knew that the jury had seen a completely different trial than I had. And they really had no choice but to vote for murder in the end.
There was absolute silence throughout. Erik and Lyle did not react in any way. I saw no tears from them.
The reaction from Los Angeles District Attorney Gil Garcetti? A fist thrust into the air, a much-needed victory for the DA. But this case is still not over. The jury must return Monday to decide what penalty to recommend.
For Erik and Lyle Menendez, the options are life and death. The jury that convicted them must now decide whether they should be executed.
In the sentencing phase, the jury were presented factors in mitigation and factors in aggravation to consider. And that's when the judge did allow some testimony about the family life.
I get asked the question a lot of whether I feel it was right for the prosecution to push hard for the death penalty. And I'm going to say at the time, I 100% believed that what the Menendez brothers did was heinous, that it was brutal, and that it was horrific. And these excuses were not resonating with me.
7 years and 2 trials later, Lyle and Erik Menendez were formally sentenced today in Los Angeles for the brutal murders of their parents. Following the recommendation of the jury that convicted them, the judge gave the brothers life in prison without parole.
The people in the LA County DA's office believe that the Menendez brothers' conviction was the correct outcome for this case, that regardless of if they were abused, that they had other options besides killing their parents. I spoke with several jurors after the penalty phase who told me if they had heard that family history and background in the guilt phase of the trial, they might not have voted for first-degree murder.
Even though that horrible crime happened and what they did was horrible, there was other things, there were good things about them that warrant their life and them living.
In the first trial, I think that the arguments of sexual and physical abuse were used to distract the jury. And the law is whether it happened or it didn't really doesn't matter, because that doesn't negate the first-degree murder. Although my personal opinion is that it didn't happen, I'll play devil's advocate. Let's say that it did. That still didn't give rise to an imperfect self-defense.
There was just so much evidence that the brothers planned the murders over a course of several days and were very calculated about it. And so even if the reason why they killed their parents was because of a lifetime of abuse, it still came down to a case of first-degree murder.
On that particular occasion, after you said no, did your father become upset?
Yes. He threw me on the bed and went to get a knife and put it at my throat.
Put the knife to your throat?
Yes.
And Was there sex with your father that day?
Yes.
The attitude of the general public has changed in the many years since the Menendez brothers were on trial in the 1990s. People are more willing to accept that this type of abuse goes on within families. People are willing to admit that these things really happen.
She would be saying, I wish you were never born. You're stupid. I hate you.
How old were you when you heard things like, I wish you were never born?
Seven.
Something happened in that house. I did not believe for 1 second that those boys were making it up. The emotion was too real. Now, was that an excuse to murder your parents? No. But did I believe them? Yes.
Do you really kill your parents that brutally for money that you already had access to? No matter how you look at it, this is a family that disintegrated into a horribly violent end. If that was an idyllic childhood and an idyllic household, it wouldn't have ended the way it ended. Something caused it to end that way. And that will always be the thing that people wonder.
The murders occurred on August the 20th, and you weren't arrested until March.
Right.
You almost got away with it, didn't you?
You know, you characterize it that way, and you think it's funny, but my brother and my life was very miserable for 6 months before we got arrested. And obviously wasn't better after we got arrested, and isn't good now. And it never really has been great. Getting arrested in some ways was a relief, and the changes that have happened are a relief.